Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first lesson on the study of existentialism for the Philosophy Academy. Now, what we're going to do in this lesson is take a very brief introduction to the series. We're going to talk essentially what existentialism is, provide something of a brief and broad definition of the concept of existentialism, and then start to talk about what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks and months in this subject on existentialism. Now, the one thing that I would want to make clear at the start is that existentialism is probably one of, if not the most interesting philosophical traditions that has come out of the philosophies of various different individuals over the last 100, 200 or so years. And the reason for this is not necessarily always to do with the content that has been established by various different thinkers, whether it be Kierkegaard, whether it be Nietzsche, whether it be Camus, but more so the thought process and the lens of analysis that existentialists tend to operate within. And what we're going to do is we're going to examine the basic meaning of existentialism in this lesson, and we're going to make it very clear that the basic meaning of existentialism is a relatively difficult thing to determine. And so when we are exploring the basic meaning of existentialism, we're doing so with one eye open on this idea that existentialism is a very difficult topic to actually explore and put a point of actual definition upon. And then we're going to start to talk about really what this series of lessons is all about, which is essentially taking a very detailed introduction to the study of existentialism for those who are interested. So this first question is essentially asking, what is existentialism? And what is it that we mean when we talk about being an existential philosopher or being a philosopher of existentialism? Well, if we're going to find a definition of existentialism, we might begin by talking about some of the key and most influential scholars in relation to existentialism. Now, arguably, the initial impetus for the movement of existentialism, the existentialist movement, comes from the works and ideas of the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Now, it wouldn't be until much later that the actual movement of existentialism would be given its actual official title, i.e. given the name, but it was Kierkegaard that really developed a number of interesting philosophical ideas and philosophical conundrums that relate to and exist in this lens of existentialism. And from here we can talk about how existentialist philosophy expands into all kinds of different areas. Specifically within philosophy, we can talk about the presentation of existentialism through the works of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, through Martin Heidegger, through Jean-Paul Sartre, and also through Albert Camus. And these are just the philosophers that look at existentialist thinking. But you also have existentialism in other areas of study. So, for example, if you're somebody who is interested in literature, people like Dostoevsky are very existentialist in their outlook and in their writing. And so, therefore, you often lump literary geniuses, shall we say, such as Dostoevsky, into this broader philosophical movement. And so the question we should ask is, okay, these are the kinds of people who we're going to be studying. These are the kind of ideas that, or at least the kind of works from which these ideas derive, people like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus. But what is the essential message? And what is the essential basis of understanding for the concept of existentialism? And in essence, the question, therefore, is what actually is existentialism as a subject? Well, existentialism invites us to consider a number of issues that could be considered as having their own separate philosophical movements in and of themselves. So we're going to be talking about the nature of the self. We're going to be talking about the value of human existence, and we're going to be talking about the meaning of life. This doesn't, however, give us a much broader, or at least any kind of more detailed definition of existentialism. So while that's the kind of thing that we're going to be examining, we're going to be examining things like the meaning of life and the nature of the self. This doesn't actually give us any, or get us any closer to coming up with an actual definition of existentialism. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre actually once described existentialism as the attempt to draw the consequences from a position of consistent atheism. And in one sense, this is a very interesting and relatively important way in which we can define or understand existentialism. But on the other hand, it misses a number of points in relation to existentialism, because what it seems to do and what it attempts to do, or at least just from this line here, just from this quote, just from this definition, is it seems to take us down a path of connecting existentialism as fundamentally linked with atheism. Now, atheism is, of course, the disbelief in a deity, a lack of a belief in God. But this isn't necessarily the case. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be an atheist to be an existentialist, and we'll get to that in a second. But what it does suggest is that one of the key concepts that exists within existentialism and the tradition of existentialism is this view of life being devoid of meaning. And this is a lot more interesting, in my opinion, talking about the way in which life may or may not be devoid of any kind of meaning. And so from there we can ask questions of how does one find meaning in a universe that is devoid of meaning? How do we find meaning in the sense of meaninglessness? So if the world and the universe and everything that we do is meaningless, then how is it that we can live and make decisions, and what kind of decisions should we be making in that regard? So from this view, we can derive a number of interesting questions relating to existentialism, or at least take a number of different philosophical inquiries, so things like the nature of the self and the nature of personal identity and existence, and ask these kinds of questions through the lens of an existentialist framework, through the lens of the universe as existing as being devoid of meaning. So one of the things I should note, and that is important that I mentioned, is that you don't necessarily have to be an atheist to be an existentialist. This is not, they're not mutually exclusive, the idea of a belief in a religion and the idea of some kind of existentialist framework. Arguably, the most foundational of the existentialist thinkers was Søren Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard was a prominent Christian thinker. And when we get to Kierkegaard over in a couple of lessons' time, you'll note that there is a lot of links between his views and the views of religious leaders and the views of religion more generally. So when we talk about existentialism, there isn't necessarily this requirement of a nexus between a view of existentialism and a view of atheism. Nor does existentialism necessarily have to adhere to any kind of specific political or social movement. So when we talk about it, we're not necessarily thinking about politics. We're not thinking about political ideology. For example, you don't have to be a liberal to be an existentialist, or a Marxist to be an existentialist, or even a conservative. And one of the key examples of this is that of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was famously a fascist who was in a lot of supported quite strongly the Nazi party in Germany, the NSDAP. So as you can see, if you want to be an existentialist, that doesn't mean you have to therefore also be a fascist, because that would probably would put a bit of a dampener on the whole movement, in my opinion. So he wrote a lot of expansive works that would be considered to be in line with existentialist ideas and existentialism more broadly, but he was also a famous fascist who was in support of the National Socialists in Germany. So let's think about what we're going to do in this series of lessons. Let's think about the scope of the series and the kinds of things we're going to talk about. It's going to take us on an introductory journey, and by introductory journey, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be examining existentialism with devoid of any kind of detail. It's going to be a pretty high-level philosophical inquiry, but it's going to be introductory in the sense that we're essentially taking a roadmap and a landscaping of this area of philosophy, and because this is an area of philosophy that spans a few hundred years and a good series of different philosophers, it's not always it's not always necessarily pertinent to be taking an advanced analysis of each of them, because that would take a very long time. But essentially what we're doing is talking about an introductory detailed analysis through the various different philosophical thinkers relating to existentialism. Now, we're going to do this in a temporal fashion, so we're going to start with the earliest and then try and make our way all the way up to the latest, so we've got a sort of chronology that takes place. But should be noted that there is obviously a lot of overlap with a number of these different philosophers. It's not like you have one philosopher dies and then another philosopher comes in and is born, and then there are a lot of these philosophers that may or may not have lived in and around the similar times. So we're just going to try and be as chronological as possible, essentially. So it means that, firstly, we're going to talk about some of the introductory remarks in the next couple of lessons. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into what the meaning of existentialism actually entails and the kind of things that we're going to be looking at. And then we'll start to think about the philosophers in question. So we're going to begin by talking about, for example, Søren Kierkegaard as our first existentialist thinker, and then we'll examine the following in the following order. We'll talk about Friedrich Nietzsche, we'll talk about Martin Heidegger, and we'll talk about Jean-Paul Sartre, and then we'll finish by thinking about the works of Albert Camus. Now, there will be a couple of others who we're going to add into this series as well, but who will be getting not necessarily a whole series of lessons dedicated to them and them only, but just to some other general ideas that they may have contributed to the broader perspective. And this is not an exhaustive list of existentialists. These are not the only existentialists who have ever lived and who could ever live in the future. These are just arguably some of the most famous and who have presented some of the most interesting ideas, in my opinion. And so therefore, if we do ever come back to this series after we've finished, we'll be talking about some more advanced ideas in existentialism, so maybe diving deeper into some of these philosophical thinkers, and also looking at potentially others and even some more from even more recent a time. So that is what we're going to be doing, and so I hope you enjoy this series of lessons, and I hope you stick around for all of them, because we are really going to be talking about one of the most interesting areas of philosophy that exists, in my opinion.